I was just trying to get home. That's all. It was late, and the gas light had been on for miles. The Ohio highway was nearly empty, just the occasional set of headlights cutting through the darkness. When I saw the flickering neon sign of a gas station up ahead, I didn't hesitate. I pulled in, swiped my card, and started filling up like I had 100 times before, but something was off. The smell was heavier, more pungent than usual. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired. I got back in my car, pulled onto the road, and that's when the nightmare began. Barely 5 minutes later, my car jerked violently. The engine sputtered like it was choking. My steering stiffened. I pushed the gas pedal, but nothing. Then, without warning, the whole car shut down. Just like that, in the middle of a dark, desolate highway. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. No service. My stomach knotted. The gas station had been my lifeline, and now, it felt like a death trap. That's when I noticed the mother cars, stranded just like mine, their drivers standing in the dark, confused and afraid. I stepped out, my heart hammering against my ribs. The other drivers looked just as panicked as I felt. Some tried to restart their engines. Others paced back and forth, cursing under their breath. One man was on the phone, shouting something about his car seizing up. That's when it hit me. Every single car that had fueled up at that station had shut down. It wasn't just me. Something was horribly wrong. A woman next to me muttered, "Bad gas. Has to be." That was the only explanation that made sense. But how? Gas stations don't just hand out bad fuel. I looked back at the road. The darkness suddenly felt heavier, pressing in on us. We were stranded, miles away from help, with no cell service. The gas station's neon sign flickered in the distance, barely visible, like a cruel joke. Then, from somewhere behind us, a car horn blared. Long, drawn out. It sounded wrong. As if the driver was slumped against it, unable to move. My breath hitched. We weren't just stranded. Something worse was happening, and we had no way out. A man named Greg decided he wasn't going to wait for help. "I'll walk back to the station. Maybe they know something," he said. We watched as he disappeared into the night. Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. No sign of him. A growing sense of dread gnawed at my gut. I wasn't the only one feeling it. A woman finally whispered, "He should be back by now." Another man pulled out a flashlight and shined it down the road. Nothing. Just the long, empty stretch of highway. That's when we heard it. A scream sharp, cut off, and then silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that sent a cold chill up my spine. Someone backed away, mumbling, "What the hell was that?" My breathing quickened. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But where? Our cars were dead. The road stretched endlessly into the black void. We were trapped. That's when we saw something moving at the edge of the flashlight beam. A figure, staggering toward us. It wasn't Greg. The figure limped closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. The flashlight shook in the man's hand as he tried to focus on it. "Who is that?" someone whispered. No answer. Then, as if the thing had been waiting, it rushed forward. The flashlight beam caught its face just in time. My stomach twisted. Its mouth was slack, eyes wide and vacant. It was Greg. But it wasn't him. His skin had taken on a grayish hue. His clothes were torn, stained with something dark. He wasn't running toward us. He was stumbling, like something was pushing him forward against his will. We backed away. "Greg?" a woman whispered. He stopped. His head twitched violently, his mouth opening as if he was trying to speak, and then he collapsed. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, from behind us, another car horn blared. Long, unbroken, the same as before. I turned slowly. More figures, more of them, stumbling toward us from the darkness. Panic broke loose. People screamed. Some ran toward their cars, desperately trying to start them. Others bolted down the highway, their footsteps fading into the night. I stood frozen, watching as more figures emerged from the darkness. Their clothes were torn, stained with oil, their bodies convulsing as if something was writhing beneath their skin. They weren't just people who had broken down. They were changing. The bad gasset wasn't just fuel, it was something else, something wrong. My brain refused to process what I was seeing, but my body finally reacted. I turned and ran. My lungs burned as I sprinted past the stranded cars, past the headlights that flickered eerily in the dark. I needed to get away, but then I heard it, a voice, weak, desperate. "Help me." I stopped, spun around. A woman was crawling out of her car, her hands shaking, her face contorted in agony. And then, right before my eyes, she went still. Her eyes rolled back, and she started to move again. I didn't think, I just ran. The gas station was my only hope, my only chance. I sprinted toward it, my legs screaming in protest. The building loomed ahead, its lights flickering. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me. The attendant stood behind the counter, his face pale. "You fueled up, didn't you?" he whispered. I nodded, my chest heaving. "What the hell is happening?" His expression darkened. "They mixed up the tanks, diesel instead of gas." But his voice dropped. There was something else in there, something that shouldn't have been. My stomach churned. I peeked out the window. The figures were getting closer. Some were crawling, dragging themselves forward. Others were already at the door, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes black, bottomless. The attendant reached under the counter. I heard the click of a shotgun. "You better pray that's enough." The glass shattered. Chaos erupted. The first one lunged, and the shotgun roared. But for every one that fell, 2 more took its place. I grabbed a heavy wrench and swung wildly. The air was thick with screams, with the sickening crunch of bodies hitting the floor. I fought my way toward the back door, my only escape. The attendant screamed behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran, out into the night, through the trees, the sound of those things still echoing in my ears. I don't remember how long I ran. Hours, maybe. When I finally collapsed on the roadside, a trucker found me, took me to safety, but I can never forget. That gas station is still there, still open, still fueling cars. But I wonder how many people left that station that night, and how many never left at all. I'll never forget that bitter January morning when my gas gauge hit empty on Highway 43. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything except the faint glow of the Valley gas sign in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the empty station, but that feeling wouldn't last long. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I parked next to the only other car there, a weathered blue sedan. Strange thing was, despite the 24/7 sign proudly displayed in the window, there wasn't a soul in sight. No attendant behind the counter, no other customers, just an eerie silence broken only by the gentle hum of the refrigerators inside. I remember checking my phone, 4:47 a.m. The coffee pot was still brewing behind the counter, steam rising from its half-filled pot. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter, like someone had just stepped away moments ago. But something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to run. I stood there for what felt like forever, debating whether to just leave or try to find someone. The security cameras blinked their red lights silently, recording my indecision. That's when I noticed other oddities. The cash register drawer was slightly open, a few bills visible inside. Keys dangled from the storage room door, swaying ever so slightly though there wasn't any breeze. The floor behind the counter had strange dark smudges that looked recent. My mind started racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty store, bouncing off the walls of snack foods and energy drinks. The silence that followed was deafening. I pulled out my phone again, thinking I should call someone, the police maybe? But who do you call when nothing is technically wrong? Just then, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A slow, steady drip coming from somewhere in the back of the store. Following that dripping sound, led me down the narrow hallway past the drink coolers. The overhead lights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the dingy walls. The bathroom door was ajar, and a thin stream of water was trickling out onto the linoleum floor. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The first thing I noticed was water overflowing from the sink, splashing onto the floor. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. There, reflected in the bathroom mirror, I saw something that would haunt me forever. A pair of work boots, sticking out from the last stall, motionless. I wanted to run, but my feet seemed frozen to the spot. The dripping had changed now. It wasn't just water anymore. A dark liquid was seeping under the stall door, spreading across the white tiles in a sinister web-like pattern. My hands shook as I dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper as I reported what I'd found. The dispatcher kept telling me to leave the building immediately, but as I turned to go, something caught my eye. On the bathroom wall, partially hidden behind the paper towel dispenser, was a message scratched into the paint. "Don't trust the blue car." The same blue car I'd parked next to. Panic seized me as I remembered seeing it in my rearview mirror several times during my drive, always maintaining the same distance. The same car that now sat silent in the parking lot, its driver nowhere to be seen. I could hear my own ragged breathing echoing off the bathroom walls. The distant sound of sirens was growing closer, but so was something else. Footsteps, coming from the front of the store. Those footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the jingling of keys. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. Through the crack in the door, I could see a shadow moving across the hallway floor. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom. My phone slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. The noise seemed to echo forever. The door slowly began to open wider, revealing a man in a dark jacket. His hands were stained with something dark, and he was holding what looked like a tire iron. Our eyes met in the mirror, and I saw no humanity in his gaze, just emptiness. Cold, calculating emptiness. He smiled then, a twisted thing that made my skin crawl. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. Everything happened in a blur. The man lunged forward just as I threw the garbage can at his legs. I heard him crash into the sink as I bolted past him, running faster than I'd ever run in my life. My feet slipped on the wet floor, but somehow I stayed upright. I could hear him behind me, cursing and scrambling to his feet. The front door seemed miles away. As I ran past the counter, I grabbed the pot of hot coffee and hurled it behind me. His scream told me I'd hit my target. The parking lot was no longer empty. Police cars were pulling in, their lights painting everything in surreal flashes of red and blue. I burst through the front door just as the first officers were drawing their weapons. "He's inside!" I screamed, collapsing onto the cold pavement. They caught him trying to escape through the back door. Turns out he was responsible for a string of gas station murders across 3 states. The attendant I found was his latest victim, killed just hours before I arrived. The blue sedan was stolen, filled with evidence of his other crimes. Sometimes I still see that scene when I close my eyes. The dripping sink, the boots in the stall, that haunting message on the wall. The detective later told me the attendant had fought back, managed to scratch out that warning about the blue car before. Well, you know, they said I was lucky. If I'd arrived just 30 minutes earlier, I might have been another victim. Now, years later, I can't drive past a gas station at night without my heart racing. But what truly haunts me isn't what I saw. It's knowing that if my gas tank had been just a little fuller that night, someone else would have found that scene instead of me. Someone else who might not have made it out alive. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed overhead as I mindlessly restocked the candy shelves, counting down the minutes until my shift ended at 3 a.m. I never liked working these late hours, but the pay was better, and beggars can't be choosers. The store was empty, as usual for this time of night, with only the occasional trucker stopping by for coffee. I remember checking my phone, 2:17 a.m., when I heard the bell above the door chime. The sound of heels frantically clicking against the linoleum floor made me look up. That's when I saw her. A woman, probably in her mid-30s, mascara running down her face, her expensive-looking dress torn at the hem. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wild with fear. "Please," she gasped. "Please help me, they're coming. I've seen my fair share of strange customers during the night shift, but something about her terror felt different. It felt real." My hand instinctively moved toward the panic button under the counter as she stumbled toward me, leaving muddy footprints in her wake. "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while scanning the parking lot through the store's windows. The woman grabbed my arm, her long nails digging into my skin. "They found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have taken it. I shouldn't have looked. But now I know too much." Her words made no sense, but the raw fear in her voice sent chills down my spine. She kept looking over her shoulder at the darkness beyond the fluorescent-lit parking lot. That's when I noticed something odd. Her expensive diamond necklace was glowing faintly, pulsing with a strange bluish light. I blinked, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks on me. The woman suddenly went rigid, her eyes widening as she stared at something through the window. I followed her gaze but saw nothing except the empty parking lot and the darkness of the woods beyond. "They're here," she breathed, her whole body trembling. What happened next still haunts me. The woman released my arm and backed away from the windows, muttering something under her breath that sounded like a prayer, or maybe a curse. The lights in the store began to flicker, and the security camera's red recording lights all went dark simultaneously. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The woman turned to me one last time, her eyes now eerily calm. "Whatever you do," she said, "don't let them see you looking." Before I could ask what she meant, all the lights in the store went out. I heard her heels clicking across the floor, then a sound like rushing wind. When the lights came back on 3 seconds later, she was gone. Not just gone from my sight, gone as if she'd never been there. Even her muddy footprints had vanished from the floor. Only the lingering scent of her perfume and the crescent-shaped nail marks on my arm proved she had been real. I called the police immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. They arrived within minutes, probably because nothing ever happens in our small town. The officers took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They checked the security footage, but just as I'd said, the cameras had gone dark at exactly the right moment. One officer suggested she might have been on drugs, another thought it was a prank, but they couldn't explain the marks on my arm or the strange electromagnetic interference that had knocked out all our electronics. As they were leaving, I noticed something glinting under the counter, a small diamond, identical to those in the woman's necklace. When I picked it up, it was ice cold to the touch, and for a split second, I swear I saw that same bluish glow. The officers logged it as evidence, but something told me this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, similar reports started coming in from other gas stations along the highway. A woman in a torn dress, begging for help, then vanishing without a trace. Each time, the same pattern: flickering lights, electrical failures, and a dramatic drop in temperature. Local news picked up the story, and that's when things got even stranger. A reporter investigating the incidents disappeared while checking out one of the locations. His camera was found in the woods, the memory card corrupted except for one image, a blurry photo of a woman's necklace glowing with that familiar blue light. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her terrified face. The nail marks on my arm refused to heal, occasionally throbbing with a cold sensation that spread through my entire body. 2 weeks after my encounter, I started noticing a pattern in the reported sightings. They were moving in a specific direction, following ley lines that a local historian had mapped decades ago. Each location was exactly 27.3 miles from the last, forming a perfect spiral pattern. When I mapped it out, I realized with horror that the next location would be my gas station again. The date would be exactly 1 month from my first encounter. I thought about quitting my job, but something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fate. As the day approached, more strange things began happening. My phone would randomly call numbers that didn't exist. In the security footage, I sometimes caught glimpses of a figure standing in the corner, wearing a familiar torn dress. The diamond I'd found kept appearing in my pocket, no matter how many times I threw it away. Tonight's my last shift at the gas station. In a few hours, it will be exactly 1 month since I saw her. The diamond is sitting on the counter in front of me, pulsing with that ethereal blue light. I've turned off all the cameras. I don't want to risk them seeing me looking. I know now what she meant. They're out there, watching, waiting. Through the windows, I can see strange lights moving in the woods. The air feels charged with electricity, and my breath is starting to fog in the increasingly cold air. The bell above the door just chimed, but I'm not looking up. Not yet. I can hear heels clicking on the linoleum floor, getting closer. She's coming to tell me something important, something that will change everything. And this time, I'm ready to listen. This time, I'm ready to learn the truth. If you're reading this, and you see a woman running into a gas station late at night, remember, don't let them see you looking. Some truths aren't meant for human eyes. That night wasn't supposed to be different from any other graveyard shift at Murphy's gas station. I'd been working here for 3 years, and the routine was always the same. Stock the shelves, count the register, watch random truckers fuel up at 2 a.m. But what happened on the 15th of October changed everything. I still can't explain it, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. The security footage disappeared, the police reports were inconclusive, and sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look down at the scar on my left hand, and I know it was real. Every single horrifying second of it was real. And now, for the first time, I'm ready to share what really happened during those 7 hours that turned my quiet night shift into a nightmare that still haunts me. Maybe someone out there can make sense of it. Or maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen him too. The night started normally enough. It was a Tuesday, usually our slowest night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that familiar sickly glow across the empty aisles. Outside, a light drizzle had started, making the neon signs reflect off the wet pavement like floating ghosts. Around midnight, I was restocking the coffee station when I heard the door chime. Nothing unusual there. We always get a few late-night customers. But something felt off. The air suddenly felt heavy, like right before a storm. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in seconds. I turned around, expecting to see another tired trucker, but instead, there he stood. A tall man in a dark coat, completely still, water dripping from his clothes onto the linoleum floor. He didn't move toward the aisles or the counter. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. I forced myself to act normal, even though every instinct told me something was wrong. "Can I help you?" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty store. He tilted his head slightly, like a confused animal. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too wide, showed too many teeth. He started walking toward the counter, but his movements were jerky, unnatural, like someone learning to walk for the first time. That's when I noticed his shoes were leaving wet marks on the floor, but they weren't water. They were dark, almost black in the fluorescent light. Blood. My heart started racing. I reached for my phone under the counter, but before I could grab it, he spoke. His voice was like gravel being crushed. "Do you remember me?" he asked. "You served me last week." But I hadn't worked last week. I'd been on vacation for the past 10 days. My hands were shaking as I watched him move through the aisles. He would pick up items, examine them with those dark eyes, then put them back in the wrong places. All the while, he kept talking, rambling about things that made no sense. About a car accident on Route 23. There is no Route 23 in our town. About his wife waiting in the car. There was no car in the parking lot. About how he needed to get home to his kids. He spoke about them in the present tense, but the details he shared made it sound like they lived decades ago. The blood trail behind him was getting wider, but he didn't seem injured. He didn't seem to notice it at all. I tried to keep him talking while I slowly reached for the panic button. That's when the lights started flickering, and he stopped mid-sentence, turning his head toward me with that terrible smile again. Everything happened so fast after that. The lights went out completely for a few seconds. When they came back on, he was standing right in front of the counter, his face inches from mine. His skin looked gray in the fluorescent light, and his eyes were completely black now. He reached out with a hand that felt ice cold and grabbed my wrist. "You need to help me," he whispered. "They're coming." Before I could ask who was coming, all the products on the shelves started rattling. The temperature dropped so low I could see my breath. He let go of my wrist and started backing away, leaving bloody handprints on everything he touched. The security cameras exploded one by one. sending sparks raining down. I ducked behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. When I finally found the courage to look up, he was standing in the middle of the store, his arms spread wide, face turned toward the ceiling. The blood that had been dripping behind him was now flowing upward, defying gravity, swirling around him like a twisted tornado. He started speaking in a language I'd never heard before, his voice growing louder and louder until it felt like the windows would shatter. The lights were strobing now, and in the flashes, I saw something impossible. His shadow on the wall didn't match his shape. It was massive, distorted, with too many limbs moving in ways that human bodies can't move. The air felt electric, charged with something ancient and wrong. Then he turned to me one last time and said something that still echoes in my nightmares. "They're here now, and they remember you too." Then, silence. Complete and absolute silence. The lights stabilized, the temperature returned to normal, and he was gone. Just gone. The only evidence that he was ever there was the trail of blood, which ended abruptly in the middle of aisle 3. The police came, of course. They took statements, collected samples, reviewed the security footage, or tried to. Every camera had been fried, and the backup system was completely wiped. The blood samples came back with impossible results. The lab said it contained proteins that don't exist in any known species. I quit that job the next day, but it didn't matter. Sometimes, late at night, I still see that smile in my dreams, and lately, I've started noticing something else, something that makes my blood run cold. The temperature in my apartment drops randomly. Objects move when I'm not looking. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something tall and dark in my mirrors, wearing that same terrible smile. It started during my regular night shift at Cooper's gas station, around 2 a.m., when the world feels like it's holding its breath. I was restocking the candy aisle, fighting to stay awake, when I heard it, a distinct metallic clang, echoing from the basement. At first, I tried to rationalize it, blame it on the old pipes or the building settling, but then it came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like footsteps. I've worked here for 3 years, and I know every creak and groan of this place. This was different. This was someone, or something, moving down there. The worst part? We keep that basement door locked at all times, and I'm the only one with the key on night shift. I remember standing there, candy bar still in hand, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed mockingly, and for a moment, I considered calling my manager, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check the security footage first. That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. I pulled up the basement camera feed on the ancient computer behind the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I clicked through the footage. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb that cast long shadows across the concrete floor and metal shelves stocked with supplies. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual empty basement scene. But as I rewound the footage to when I first heard the noise, my blood ran cold. There, in the grainy black and white footage, stood a man. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything at all. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his face turned directly toward the camera. His eyes, God, his eyes, seemed to stare right through the screen and into my soul. I couldn't make out his features clearly in the poor quality footage, but something about his stillness felt wrong, inhuman almost. The timestamp showed he'd been standing there for over an hour, not moving a muscle, just staring at me. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a glitch in the system, or maybe someone had tampered with the footage, but deep down, I knew what I was seeing was real. I checked the live feed again, and my heart nearly stopped. He was still there, in the exact same position, still staring. I grabbed my flashlight from under the counter, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The weight of the basement key felt like lead in my pocket. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to call the police, to do anything but go down there. But I was the only one on duty, and if there really was an intruder, I needed to know. Besides, the basement only had one entrance, and I had the key. Whoever was down there had to still be there. I just needed to verify what I was seeing with my own eyes. Standing at the top of the basement stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I could hear my own ragged breathing echoing off the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with a musty smell that seemed stronger than usual. Each step down creaked under my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, creating shifting shadows that made my heart race. The security camera's red recording light blinked steadily in the corner, reminding me of what I'd seen. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my light immediately finding the spot where the man had been standing. But there was nothing there, just empty space between the metal shelves. I swept my light around the room, checking every corner, behind every shelf. The basement wasn't large, and there was nowhere to hide. Yet somehow, impossibly, it was completely empty. Relief flooded through me initially. At least there wasn't an intruder. But that relief quickly turned to confusion, then to dread. Because if there was no one down here, how had I seen him on the camera? I hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me with trembling hands. When I checked the security feed again, my heart nearly stopped. The footage from just minutes ago showed me searching the basement with my flashlight, but there was something else, something I hadn't seen while I was down there. In the corner of the frame, partially hidden behind a shelf, I could make out a figure. It moved when I moved, staying just outside my flashlight beam, always keeping the same distance. And as I watched myself leave the basement, it turned to face the camera once again, those same hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to work another night shift, knowing what might be lurking in that basement. The manager didn't believe my story, of course. He reviewed the security footage himself but found nothing unusual, just me wandering around an empty basement with a flashlight. The footage I'd seen, the man with the staring eyes, was gone as if it had never existed. But I know what I saw. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still feel those eyes watching me through the camera. And lately, I've been hearing strange metallic clangs coming from my own basement. But I won't be checking the security cameras this time. Some things are better left unseen. Some questions better left unanswered. Because sometimes, when you stare into the darkness, something stares back.